Behind the Doors' hypnotic rhythms and Morrison's leather-clad mystique lies a treasure trove of bizarre stories that would make even their wildest songs seem tame. From Jim Morrison's fake family obituary to a bath full of ice-packed corpse, from getting fired for an Oedipal rant to Ray Manzarek playing two instruments with different hands simultaneously, the legendary band's history reads like a fever dream of 1960s excess, mixed with surprisingly tender moments and shocking deceptions. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Doors. Fact 1. Morrison declared his family dead. When the Doors were preparing promotional materials for their debut album in 1966, Elektra Records asked each band member to write a brief biography for the press. While Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore provided standard information about their backgrounds and families, Jim Morrison took a dramatically different approach. When asked to list his parents and siblings, Morrison simply wrote one word: deceased. This wasn't a tragic truth about Morrison's past, it was a complete fabrication. His father, George Stephen Morrison, was very much alive and serving as a rear admiral in the United States Navy, stationed in Arlington, Virginia. His mother Clara and his younger siblings Andy and Ann were also alive and well. Morrison had deliberately erased his family from his public persona, creating the myth that he was an orphan who had emerged from nowhere to become a rock star. The deception was so convincing that even Morrison's closest friends believed the story. For years, bandmates and girlfriends had no idea that Morrison came from a military family with a father who held a high-ranking position in the Navy. The fabrication allowed Morrison to reinvent himself completely, shedding what he saw as the constraints of his conservative military upbringing to become the rebellious poet and performer known as the Lizard King. Morrison's relationship with his family had become severely strained during his college years at UCLA. His father had written him a letter, urging him to give up any idea of singing or any connection with a music group because of what I consider to be a complete lack of talent in this direction. After receiving this harsh dismissal of his artistic ambitions, Morrison effectively cut all ties with his family. They spoke only once more, a brief phone conversation before Morrison's death in 1971. The family learned about Morrison's rock star status in the most surprising way possible. Morrison's brother Andy only discovered that Jim was the lead singer of The Doors when a college classmate showed him the album cover and pointed out the resemblance. By then, Morrison had been famous for months, living a completely separate life from the family he had publicly declared dead. Fact 2. The band got fired for incest. On August 21, 1966, The Doors performed their final show as the house band at the legendary Whiskey A Go Go nightclub on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. What should have been just another night of music turned into the moment that got them permanently banned from one of rock's most important venues, all because Jim Morrison decided to unleash the full, uncensored version of their song, The End. The Doors had been serving as the club's house band since May, opening for major acts and building their reputation in the Los Angeles music scene. They typically performed 2 sets per night for audiences that included industry insiders, celebrities, and devoted fans who came specifically to see the mysterious young band with the charismatic lead singer. The arrangement had been crucial for their development, giving them steady income and exposure while they perfected their sound. During their second set that Sunday night, Morrison began performing The End, a song that usually concluded with mysterious, poetic lyrics about death and transformation. But this time, something was different. Morrison had been experimenting with the song's structure and had recently been inspired by the ancient Greek tragedy of Oedipus Rex. As the song built to its climactic moment, Morrison suddenly launched into an explicit retelling of the Oedipal myth, screaming the now infamous lines about wanting to kill his father and have sexual relations with his mother. The club's owner, Mario Maglieri, was watching from the audience and was absolutely horrified by what he was hearing. The explicit sexual and violent content was far beyond anything that had ever been performed at the venue, even in an era when rock music was pushing boundaries. The moment Morrison finished the song and walked off stage, Maglieri immediately fired the entire band. Morrison later explained what happened in a 1967 interview, saying, "One Sunday night at Whiskey A Go Go, something clicked. I realized what the whole song was about, what it had been leading up to. It was powerful. It just happened. They fired us the next day." Ironically, getting fired from the Whiskey A Go Go turned out to be perfectly timed for the Doors, since they had signed with Elektra Records just 3 days earlier and were ready to move beyond their house band status to become recording artists. Fact 3. Morrison's body stayed in ice for 72 hours. When Jim Morrison was found dead in his Paris apartment bathtub on the morning of July 3, 1971, what happened next was almost as mysterious as the circumstances of his death itself. According to multiple sources and accounts from that time, Morrison's body remained in that same bathtub for 72 hours, wrapped in plastic and packed with ice, before undertakers finally arrived to remove it. Morrison's girlfriend, Pamela Corson, had discovered his body around 6 in the morning. But instead of immediately calling authorities or medical professionals, she chose to handle the situation in an extremely unusual way. The official death certificate listed heart failure as the cause of death, but no autopsy was ever performed, which was highly irregular for someone who died so young and under unclear circumstances. During those 3 days, Morrison's body stayed submerged in the bathtub where Corson had found him, preserved with ice while she made arrangements and decided how to handle the situation. This bizarre preservation method has never been fully explained, and no coherent account was ever given for why the body remained there for so long before proper authorities were contacted. The Doors road manager Bill Siddons later recalled that when he arrived in Paris on July 6th, he was met by Corson, a sealed coffin, and a signed death certificate, but he never actually saw Morrison's body. In fact, aside from Corson herself, no one else ever viewed Morrison's corpse, including his family members, close friends, or bandmates who might have been able to confirm his identity or the circumstances of his death. The unusual handling of Morrison's death, combined with the extended period his body remained in the apartment, has fueled decades of conspiracy theories about what really happened during those final days in Paris. Some have suggested that the ice preservation was an attempt to disguise the actual time of death, while others believe it was simply the result of Corson's shock and uncertainty about how to proceed. The lack of an autopsy, the sealed coffin, and the strange 3-day delay before official procedures began have made Morrison's death one of rock music's most enduring mysteries, with the ice-packed bathtub serving as one of the most unsettling details in an already bizarre story. Fact 4. Ray Manzarek was a two-handed genius. Ray Manzarek possessed one of the most remarkable musical talents in rock history, literally splitting his brain into 2 separate musicians and playing what should have been 2 different instruments simultaneously. While most keyboardists focus on playing one part with both hands, Manzarek developed an extraordinary technique where his left hand played bass lines on a Fender Rhodes piano bass, while his right hand handled rhythm and melody parts on a Vox Continental organ. This unique setup meant that the Doors could function as a complete rock band without ever needing a dedicated bass player, which was almost unheard of in the music world of the 1960s. Manzarek's left hand essentially became the band's bass player, pumping out the low-end rhythms that drove songs like Break On Through and Light My Fire, while his right hand provided the bright, sparkly organ sounds that became the Doors' signature musical voice. The technical difficulty of this approach cannot be overstated, as it required Manzarek to think like 2 different musicians at the same time, with each hand following completely independent musical parts that had to work together perfectly. Drummer John Densmore later explained how crucial this was to the band's sound, saying that bass players and drummers are like musical partners who cook the groove together, and if Manzarek's left hand and his drumming didn't sync up perfectly, there wouldn't be any Doors. Beyond just playing 2 instruments at once, Manzarek also served as the band's timekeeper, meaning the other 3 members followed his musical lead to stay together as a group. Guitarist Robbie Krieger remembered that Manzarek was probably the most solid musician when they started, and since he had the best sense of timing in the band, everyone else naturally followed his rhythm. This incredible musical multitasking ability allowed the Doors to create their distinctive sound with just 4 members instead of the typical 5-piece rock band setup. Manzarek's dual-handed genius became so central to their music that when people hear classic Doors songs today, they're actually listening to one man playing what sounds like 2 completely different instruments, perfectly coordinated to create some of rock's most memorable musical moments. Fact 5. Morrison nearly got naked on Ed Sullivan. On September 17, 1967, the Doors appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, one of the most important television programs in America. But Jim Morrison turned what should have been a career-making moment into an act of deliberate rebellion that got them banned forever. The band had been invited to perform their #1 hit, Light My Fire, on national television, reaching millions of viewers who could make or break a musical career with a single performance. Earlier that afternoon during rehearsal, a CBS producer approached the Doors in their dressing room with a specific request that would set up the evening's drama. He told them they needed to change one particular lyric in Light My Fire from Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher to something less controversial, explaining that the word higher was inappropriate for a family television show because of its obvious association with illegal drug use. Morrison was furious about the censorship request and initially refused to make any changes to his lyrics, but the rest of the band convinced him to agree to the alteration so they wouldn't lose this massive opportunity to reach a national audience. The producer left their dressing room believing he had successfully negotiated a compromise with the rebellious rock band. When showtime arrived, the Doors took the stage and performed flawlessly through the first part of Light My Fire, with Morrison singing exactly as he had promised during rehearsal. But when the crucial moment arrived and Morrison reached the controversial lyric, he looked directly into the camera and sang the original words with complete defiance. Girl, we couldn't get much higher. The cameras caught guitarist Robbie Krieger's immediate reaction, showing him with a quick but unmistakable smirk as he realized what Morrison had just done on live national television. Meanwhile, the show's producer and CBS executives were absolutely livid backstage, knowing that Morrison had deliberately broken his promise and exposed their family-friendly program to exactly the kind of drug reference they had tried to avoid. Ed Sullivan himself maintained his professional composure, clapping politely and telling the audience, "That was wonderful," after their performance, but the damage was done. The Doors were immediately and permanently banned from ever appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show again, making Morrison one of the first rock stars to sacrifice mainstream television success for artistic integrity. Fact 6. The Amsterdam Hash Hospital Incident. During the Doors' 1968 European tour, Jim Morrison managed to miss their entire Amsterdam concert in one of the most embarrassing ways possible, thanks to a well-meaning gift from Bob Haidt, the lead singer of the blues rock band Canned Heat. What started as a friendly gesture between musicians turned into a medical emergency that left Morrison unconscious and his bandmates performing without their lead singer. The incident began when Morrison encountered Haidt, who was known for his massive size and equally large appetite for various substances. Haidt offered Morrison what he described as a piece of hash, which Morrison accepted without asking too many questions about its potency or proper dosage. Instead of smoking the hash in the traditional way, Morrison decided to simply swallow the entire lump, not realizing that this method would deliver a much more intense and unpredictable effect. Within a short time, the hash hit Morrison's system with overwhelming force, causing him to lose consciousness completely. He was rushed to a local Amsterdam hospital, where he slowly regained awareness in what must have been one of the most surreal moments of his life. When Morrison finally opened his eyes, he found himself surrounded by Catholic nuns who were running the medical facility. The most embarrassing part of the entire situation was that these nuns immediately understood exactly what had happened to Morrison and why he was in their hospital. They had clearly seen this type of drug-related incident before and knew the signs of someone who had consumed too much cannabis. Morrison later told a funny story about the experience, describing how these religious women were changing his bed linens and taking care of him while being completely aware of his drug-induced condition, yet treating him with professional medical care despite their obvious disapproval. Meanwhile, the Doors were left to perform their Amsterdam concert without their lead singer, forcing Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore to either cancel the show or find a way to entertain the audience as an instrumental trio. Morrison's absence from what should have been an important European performance became a source of embarrassment for the band, but Morrison himself seemed to find the entire situation amusing once he recovered from his hash-induced adventure. Fact 7. First song success, beginner's luck. Robbie Krieger may have achieved the greatest beginner's luck in rock and roll history when he wrote "Light My Fire," which became the Doors' biggest hit and one of the most recognizable songs of the 1960s. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that "Light My Fire" was literally the very first song Krieger had ever completed in his entire life, written only because Jim Morrison was getting tired of being the band's sole songwriter. During the early days of the Doors, Morrison had been writing all of the band's original material, creating the lyrics and basic song structures that would become classics like "Break On Through" and "The End." But as the band developed and prepared for recording their debut album, Morrison realized they needed more songs, and that he shouldn't have to carry the entire creative burden alone. One day, Morrison approached the 20-year-old Krieger with a direct challenge, essentially saying, "Why don't you write some songs? Why do I have to do all the work?" Krieger had never attempted to write a complete song before, having focused primarily on learning guitar techniques and developing his instrumental skills. When he asked Morrison what he should write about, Morrison gave him simple but brilliant advice: write about something universal. Krieger took that guidance and created a song about one of the most universal human experiences, love and desire, using the metaphor of fire to represent passion. The result was "Light My Fire," a song that perfectly captured the sensual heat and excitement of the Summer of Love era. Krieger composed both the music and the basic structure, while Morrison contributed some additional lyrics, including the memorable line, "Love Become a Funeral Pyre." The song became the Doors' first #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100, selling over 1 million copies and establishing the band as major players in the rock music world. It remains one of the most played classic rock songs on radio stations around the world, and its distinctive guitar riff and organ melody are instantly recognizable to music fans across multiple generations. For a guitarist who had never written a song before, creating what would become one of rock's most enduring anthems on his first attempt represents an almost impossible stroke of creative luck that launched both his songwriting career and the Doors' path to stardom. Fact 8. The $75,000 Buick Betrayal. In 1968, the Doors nearly destroyed their artistic integrity and possibly their entire band over a $75,000 offer from Buick that would have turned their passionate love song, "Light My Fire," into a car commercial. The incident occurred while Jim Morrison was staying in London with his girlfriend Pamela Corson, working on his poetry, and completely unaware that his 3 bandmates were considering one of the most commercially crass decisions in rock history. After the Doors had completed their European tour in September of 1968, Morrison decided to remain in London under the encouraging guidance of writer Michael McClure, focusing on his literary ambitions while the rest of the band returned to Los Angeles. During this period, representatives from Buick contacted the Doors with an incredibly lucrative advertising proposal that would have featured their biggest hit song in a national television campaign. The car company's marketing team had developed what they thought was a clever twist on the song's famous lyrics, proposing to change "Come on baby, light my fire" to "Come on Buick, light my fire" for their commercials. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore found the offer financially tempting especially since $75,000 represented an enormous sum of money for a young rock band in the late 1960s. Manzarek later admitted that he thought it was an interesting idea, and that the three of them seriously considered accepting the deal without consulting Morrison, who seemed more focused on his poetry than on the band's business decisions. However, when Morrison eventually learned about the proposed commercial licensing agreement, his reaction was explosive and immediate. Morrison was absolutely furious that his bandmates had even considered allowing their music to be used to sell cars, viewing it as a complete betrayal of everything the Doors represented as artists. He threatened to make his displeasure visible and dramatic, promising that if the Buick deal went through, he would smash a Buick automobile on stage during every single Doors concert from that point forward. The threat worked perfectly, and the band immediately abandoned any plans to license "Light My Fire" for commercial use. Morrison's passionate defense of their artistic integrity prevented what could have been a devastating blow to the Doors' credibility as serious musicians, and cemented his reputation as an uncompromising artist who refused to let corporate interests dilute their creative vision. Fact 9. Morrison was scared of needles. Despite decades of rumors and speculation about Jim Morrison's drug use, particularly involving heroin, multiple sources close to the singer confirmed that he had a genuine phobia of needles that prevented him from ever injecting any substances. This fear was so intense that even during his heaviest periods of drug experimentation, Morrison would only consume substances through smoking, drinking, or snorting, never through injection. Morrison's terror of needles was well documented by friends, bandmates, and witnesses who observed his behavior throughout his career. Sam Burnett, a former Paris nightclub manager who claimed to have witnessed Morrison's final hours, specifically noted that Morrison was scared of needles, so never injected drugs. This detail has been corroborated by other people who knew Morrison personally and observed his consistent avoidance of anything involving syringes or injection. The needle phobia becomes particularly significant when examining the various theories about Morrison's death in Paris on July 3, 1971. Many conspiracy theories and alternative accounts of his death have suggested that he died from a heroin overdose, but these theories typically assume that Morrison would have injected the drug directly into his bloodstream for maximum effect. Morrison's documented fear of needles adds an important layer to understanding what may have actually happened during his final days in Paris. If he had experimented with heroin, as some witnesses have claimed, he would have consumed it by snorting it rather than injecting it, which produces a different type of reaction and absorption rate in the body. This distinction has contributed to the conflicting accounts and theories surrounding his death, because witnesses and investigators may have made assumptions about how Morrison would have used certain substances without understanding his specific phobia. Some accounts suggest that Morrison had been given what he thought was cocaine, but was actually heroin, and that he snorted it without realizing the increased potency of the drug. The needle phobia also helps explain why Morrison maintained his reputation as someone who preferred alcohol and psychedelic drugs over harder substances like heroin, since his fear would have naturally limited him to substances that could be consumed without injection, keeping him away from what many considered the most dangerous forms of drug use during that era. Fact 10. The fake death theory evidence. Jim Morrison had talked so frequently and seriously about faking his own death that even his closest friends and bandmates believed he was capable of actually pulling off such an elaborate deception. Throughout his career, Morrison often joked with friends that one day he would simply disappear from his rock star life and start over completely, sometimes mentioning specific plans to escape to Africa and change his identity to avoid the pressures of fame. The name Morrison had chosen for his hypothetical new identity was particularly clever and revealing: Mr. Mojo Risen, which is a perfect anagram of his real name, Jim Morrison. This wasn't just a casual nickname or random phrasite, was a carefully constructed alternate identity that Morrison had thought about seriously enough to work out the letters and create a believable new persona for his imagined escape from celebrity. Morrison's fascination with the idea of disappearing and reinventing himself wasn't just idle fantasy, according to those who knew him best. Ray Manzarek, the Doors keyboardist and Morrison's closest friend in the band, publicly stated that if anyone could successfully stage their own death and vanish without a trace, it would definitely be Jim Morrison. Manzarek based this assessment on conversations he remembered having with Morrison in 1970, where the singer had discussed his desire to escape his current life and start fresh somewhere completely different. The timing of these conversations is particularly significant because they occurred during the period when Morrison was facing serious legal troubles, including his conviction for indecent exposure in Miami and potential jail time if his appeal failed. Morrison was also dealing with more than 20 paternity suits and had been arrested by the FBI for being drunk and disorderly on an airplane, facing a possible 10-year sentence for that incident alone. Morrison's life had become so complicated and stressful by 1971 that the idea of disappearing entirely would have seemed like an attractive solution to his mounting problems. He had repeatedly expressed his frustration with fame and his desire to focus on writing poetry rather than performing as a rock star, making the concept of faking his death and starting over as a completely different person seem like a logical, if extreme, way to escape his troubles and pursue his true artistic interests. Fact 11. They recorded an album in their office. When the Doors decided to record their sixth and final studio album with Jim Morrison in 1971, they made the unusual choice to abandon professional recording studios entirely and set up their equipment in their cramped business office at 8512 Santa Monica Boulevard in Hollywood. This decision came about because Morrison had grown tired of the formal, sterile atmosphere of traditional recording studios and wanted to create music in a more relaxed, intimate environment. The idea was suggested by their longtime engineer Bruce Botnick, who recognized that Morrison was struggling with the pressures and constraints of studio recording and needed a different approach to capture his best performances. The office space was far from ideal for recording music, with low ceilings, limited room for equipment, and none of the acoustic treatment or soundproofing that professional studios provided. Despite these challenges, the band transformed their business headquarters into a makeshift recording studio, bringing in all the necessary equipment and creating what was essentially a basement rehearsal space atmosphere in their workplace. The intimate setting allowed Morrison to feel more comfortable and natural while singing, without the pressure of expensive studio time ticking away or the formal environment that had become increasingly difficult for him to handle. The recording sessions for L.A. Woman took place over just 10 sessions spanning about 7 days, which was an incredibly fast pace that demonstrated how well the relaxed office environment worked for the band's creative process. Morrison's vocals were recorded live, along with the instrumental tracks, capturing a raw, immediate energy that many critics and fans consider to be some of his best singing on any Doors album. The album included guest musicians guitarist Mark Beno and bassist Jerry Sheff, who helped fill out the sound and contributed to the blues-influenced direction of the music. The office recording setup proved so successful that L.A. Woman became one of the Doors' most critically acclaimed albums, featuring classic tracks like the title song and Riders on the Storm. This unconventional recording approach demonstrated that great music doesn't require expensive studios or perfect acoustic conditions, but rather the right creative atmosphere where artists feel comfortable expressing themselves authentically, something Morrison found in their humble office space rather than in any professional recording facility. Fact 12. Morrison's favorite album was Pet Sounds. Jim Morrison, the dark and mysterious frontman known as the Lizard King who sang about death, chaos, and rebellion, had surprisingly gentle musical tastes when he wasn't performing with the Doors. His favorite album of all time was the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, one of the most melodic and harmonious records ever created, which seems completely opposite to the brooding, psychedelic rock that made Morrison famous. This revelation about Morrison's musical preferences shows a completely different side of his personality that fans rarely got to see during his public performances or interviews. While audiences knew him for his intense, often dark stage presence and lyrics about breaking through to the other side and riding the storm, Morrison privately gravitated toward music that was sophisticated, melodic, and emotionally complex, rather than aggressive or rebellious. Morrison's regular listening habits were even more surprising than his love for pet sounds, as he spent much of his personal time enjoying the smooth vocals of Frank Sinatra and the jazz stylings of Peggy Lee, rather than listening to rock music or the psychedelic sounds that were popular during the 1960s. These artists represented a completely different musical world from the Doors, focusing on classic American songwriting, polished vocal techniques, and elegant arrangements. His appreciation for Sinatra's vocal style actually influenced Morrison's own singing approach, particularly evident in his more crooning moments on Doors songs where he would drop his voice to a lower, more intimate register. Morrison once described Sinatra as one of his vocal heroes, along with Elvis Presley, showing that he drew inspiration from singers who were masters of emotional expression and vocal control, rather than just raw power or rebellion. Morrison's choice in personal music listening also extended to classical music, which he would often play when he wanted to relax or think. This preference for sophisticated, well-crafted music over the loud, experimental rock that surrounded him in Los Angeles suggests that Morrison viewed his role in the Doors as a performance persona, while his true musical heart was drawn to timeless melodies and expertly crafted songs that had nothing to do with the counterculture movement he helped represent. Fact 13. The band had a massive legal war. More than 30 years after Jim Morrison's death, the surviving members of the Doors became locked in one of the most bitter and ugly legal battles in rock history, a 6-year war that tore apart friendships and resulted in accusations so extreme that drummer John Densmore was labeled an anti-American communist terrorist sympathizer by his former bandmates' legal team. The conflict began in 2003 when Cadillac offered the Doors a record-breaking $15 million deal to use their music in car commercials. But Densmore refused to approve the licensing agreement, remembering Morrison's fury over a similar Buick proposal decades earlier. Under the band's original agreement, all business decisions required unanimous approval from all 4 members, and Densmore felt that allowing their music to sell cars would betray everything Morrison had stood for as an artist. Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger were furious about losing such an enormous payday and began touring under the name The Doors of the 21st Century with other musicians, using the band's original name in large bold letters while printing everything else in tiny fine print. Densmore and Morrison's estate sued to stop them from using the Doors name without permission, while Manzarek and Krieger countersued Densmore for $40 million in lost revenue. The courtroom battle became incredibly personal and vicious, with the opposing legal team attacking Densmore's character in the most extreme ways possible. They accused him of being an eco-terrorist because he supported environmental organizations, labeled him as anti-American for refusing the Cadillac deal, and even suggested he was a communist who supported Al-Qaeda, all because he wouldn't let them commercialize Morrison's legacy. Densmore later described feeling betrayed, hurt, and completely alone during the legal proceedings, unable to believe the outrageous accusations being made against him by lawyers representing his former friends and musical partners. The case dragged on for years, consuming enormous amounts of money and emotional energy while destroying relationships that had lasted for decades. Eventually, Densmore and the Morrison estate prevailed in court, preventing Manzarek and Krieger from using the Doors name for commercial touring, but the damage to their personal relationships had been done, turning former bandmates into bitter enemies over money and artistic integrity. Fact 14. Morrison's UCLA film was destroyed. Jim Morrison's experimental student film at UCLA met such a harsh reception from his professor and classmates that it was literally thrown in the garbage at the end of the semester, making it one of the most brutally rejected creative works by someone who would later become a cultural icon. Morrison had enrolled in UCLA's prestigious film school with serious ambitions to become a filmmaker, but his artistic vision proved to be far too unconventional for the academic environment of the mid-1960s. The film itself was an abstract, experimental piece that Morrison had poured considerable creative energy into. But when it was screened for his film class, the reaction was overwhelmingly negative. His professor and fellow students found the work confusing, pretentious, and completely lacking in the technical skills and narrative structure they expected from a serious film school project. Ray Manzarek, who was a graduate student in the same film program and would later become Morrison's bandmate in The Doors, was one of the few people who defended Morrison's creative vision. In his autobiography, Light My Fire, Manzarek described Morrison's film as cinematic poetry, recognizing an artistic sensibility that the rest of the class had missed or dismissed as amateur experimentation. According to Manzarek's account, Morrison's film was raked over the coals during the class critique, with students and the instructor harshly criticizing every aspect of the work. The negative reception was so severe that Morrison became deeply discouraged about his filmmaking prospects and began to question whether he had any future in the movie industry. UCLA's policy at the time was to retain only the student films that were selected for the prestigious Royce Hall screenings, a twice-yearly public showcase of the best work produced by film school students. Morrison's experimental piece was definitely not chosen for this honor, which meant it was treated like any other failed assignment. Manzarek wrote that Morrison's film was tossed out with 300 or so other student movies at the end of the semester, describing how the only films that were saved were the big ones that had the negative cut and a composite made for the big show in Royce. The other films were like term papercents, seen and tossed. Fact 15. The mysterious death cover-up. In 2007, 36 years after Jim Morrison's death, a former Paris nightclub manager named Sam Burnett came forward with a shocking alternative account of what really happened on July 3, 1971, claiming that Morrison actually died in a toilet stall at the Rock and Roll Circus nightclub and that his body was secretly moved to his apartment to cover up the scandal. Burnett, who had been in his early 20s when he managed the popular Left Bank Club, said he had kept this story secret for decades until his wife encouraged him to write a book about the experience. According to Burnett's account, Morrison arrived at the Rock and Roll Circus in the early morning hours looking to buy heroin for his girlfriend Pamela Corson, meeting with two drug dealers before heading to the club's bathroom around 2 o'clock in the morning. When Morrison failed to come out of the bathroom stall after about 30 minutes, a cloakroom attendant told Burnett that someone was locked inside and wasn't responding to knocks on the door. Burnett had a bouncer break down the door and found Morrison's body slumped over the toilet, with foam and blood coming from his mouth, leading Burnett to believe he had died from snorting heroin. Burnett brought in a customer who worked as a doctor to examine Morrison, and the medical professional confirmed that the singer was dead. At this point, according to Burnett's story, the two drug dealers who had sold Morrison the heroin suddenly appeared and insisted that Morrison was still alive, just unconscious, and that they would take care of him by bringing him home. The club's owner allegedly called Burnett shortly after the dealers had carried Morrison's body away, warning him never to speak about what had happened to protect the club from scandal. Burnett also claimed that singer Marianne Faithfull was present at the club that night and witnessed the events, but she was similarly sworn to secrecy and never mentioned Morrison's name again after that evening. This account, if true, would mean that Morrison's death was covered up by moving his body from the nightclub to his apartment bathtub, where Corson would later claim to have discovered him, creating the official story that has been accepted for over 50 years.